I have presided over thousands of disputes during my years on the bench. I have listened to angry neighbors, dishonest business owners, manipulative spouses, and people who believed the law simply did not apply to them. But there was one woman I still remember with unusual clarity, not because the case involved millions of dollars, not because anyone was physically harmed, and not because the legal issues were particularly complicated. I remember her because she walked into my courtroom carrying a level of arrogance that I rarely witnessed even among repeat offenders. What happened 30 seconds after she openly challenged my authority became one of the most unforgettable moments I have ever experienced. Even now, years later, I can still picture the expression on her face, the confidence, the smirk, the certainty that she was untouchable, and then the panic. If you've spent enough years as a judge, you develop instincts about people. You learn that most nervous defendants are not necessarily guilty. You learn that confident people are not necessarily innocent. And sometimes the loudest person in the room is desperately trying to hide the truth. The woman at the center of this case was named Karen Whitmore, 43 years old, well-dressed, perfect hair, dar handbag, expensive jewelry. The kind of person who wanted everyone around her to know exactly how important she believed she was. The case itself seemed relatively straightforward when I reviewed the file that morning. A property damage dispute. The plaintiff, Emily Dawson, was seeking compensation for extensive damage caused to her small family-owned bakery. At first glance, it looked like a typical civil disagreement, but something about the witness statements caught my attention. Multiple people had described the defendant using the exact same words, entitled, aggressive, uncooperative. That kind of consistency is unusual. When several unrelated witnesses describe someone the same way, I pay attention because patterns reveal character, and character often reveals truth. I remember looking toward the courtroom doors as the bailiff announced the parties. Emily Dawson entered first. She looked exhausted, not angry, not dramatic, just tired. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of someone carrying stress for far too long. Behind her walked Karen Whitmore. The contrast was striking. Karen entered as if she were attending a social event rather than a court proceeding. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't concerned. In fact, she appeared amused. I noticed her rolling her eyes while Emily organized paperwork at the plaintiff's table. That was the first thing that bothered me. People who understand the seriousness of court usually show at least some respect for the process. Karen showed none. As the hearing began, I asked both parties to identify themselves for the record. Emily answered politely. Karen answered with visible irritation. That alone wasn't unusual. Many people dislike being in court. But then I started asking preliminary questions, civil questions, basic facts, dates, locations, events, and Karen repeatedly interrupted, not occasionally, repeatedly. Every time Emily attempted to explain something, Karen would laugh, sigh loudly, or shake her head dramatically. The spectators began noticing it too. I could see people exchanging glances from the gallery. They sensed what I sensed. Something was off. Years on the bench teach you to watch body language more carefully than words. Words can be rehearsed. Body language rarely is. Karen wasn't acting like someone defending herself. She was acting like someone who believed the courtroom existed for her entertainment. Then came the moment that changed everything. I asked her a direct question. A very simple question. I asked whether she had complied with multiple written warnings sent by the property management company before the incident occurred. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, smiled, actually smiled. And then she said something that caused the entire courtroom to become silent, not because she raised her voice, not because she used profanity, but because of how casually she said it. She looked directly at me and said, "I don't follow rules." A few people in the gallery laughed nervously. Others stared. Emily Dawson looked shocked, and I remember feeling something very unusual. Not anger, curiosity, because people often reveal far more than they intend when they believe they are winning. I folded my hands on the bench and studied her carefully. Karen still had that confident smile. She thought she had made herself look powerful. Instead, she had just opened a door she didn't even realize existed. Because sitting inside the evidence file on my desk was a document I had reviewed only minutes before court began. A document Karen clearly didn't know existed, a document that would destroy nearly every claim she had made. And 30 seconds later, the woman who proudly announced she didn't follow rules would be begging for mercy in front of everyone. But before that happened, I needed to ask one more question, a question that would expose the first crack in her entire story. And when I asked it, the courtroom atmosphere changed instantly. The moment I saw Karen Whitmore's smile begin to fade, I knew we were entering a very different courtroom than the one she believed she controlled. I've often told people that trials are rarely won by dramatic speeches. They are won by details, small details, tiny contradictions, pieces of evidence that quietly destroy an entire story. Karen didn't understand that yet. She thought confidence could replace facts. Unfortunately for her, courts operate on facts, and facts can be merciless. I looked down at the document resting inside the case file. Then I looked back at Karen. Ms. Whitmore, I said calmly, you stated under oath that you never received any formal warnings from property management before the incident. Is that correct? That's exactly what I said, she replied immediately. No hesitation, no uncertainty, confidence, the kind of confidence that often makes inexperienced jurors believe someone. But after decades on the bench, I've learned something important. Liars often answer too quickly. Truthful people usually think they search their memory, they reflect. Karen didn't reflect. She performed, and performances eventually collapse. I turned toward Emily Dawson. The young bakery owner looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized documents. I noticed something else, too. She kept looking at the floor. People assume victims always appear emotional. That's not always true. Sometimes prolonged stress creates exhaustion instead of anger. Emily looked exhausted. The bakery she inherited from her late father had been struggling for months. According to the court filings, a major water leak had caused extensive damage to equipment, ingredients, and interior property. The repair costs were devastating. Nearly $60,000. For a large corporation, that's inconvenient. For a family bakery, it's catastrophic. What made the situation worse was the allegation that the damage could have been prevented. Emily claimed Karen had repeatedly violated building policies while managing the commercial unit directly above the bakery. Multiple warnings had allegedly been issued, multiple opportunities to fix the problem, yet nothing changed until disaster struck. Karen had denied every part of that story, aggressively, confidently, under oath. That is a dangerous combination when evidence exists. I opened the file. The courtroom became quiet. I've witnessed this silence thousands of times. It's the silence that appears when people sense something important is about to happen. Even spectators can feel it. The air changes. People stop shifting in their seats. Whispers disappear. Everyone waits. I removed a certified document from the file. Karen's expression remained relaxed, for now. Ms. Whitmore, I asked, would you like to explain why your signature appears on 3 separate warning notices? For the first time all morning, she froze. Only for a second. Most people would have missed it. I didn't. The eyes widened, the shoulders stiffened, the smile disappeared, then came the recovery attempt. What warning notices? That answer interested me, not as she didn't deny the signature. She questioned the notices. That distinction matters. Very few people realize how revealing language can be. A person's first reaction often exposes exactly what frightens them. I handed the documents to the bailiff. The bailiff delivered them to Karen. The courtroom watched. Karen stared down at the pages. 1 page. Then another. Then another. The confidence drained from her face so quickly it almost seemed unreal. I remember noticing her breathing change. Shorter. Faster. A psychological shift was happening in real time, and everyone could see it, even the spectators. Especially Emily, the bakery owner's eyes widened as she watched Karen struggle. For months, nobody had believed her. For months, she had been told she was overreacting. For months, she had carried the financial burden alone. Now the truth was beginning to surface, and it was only the beginning. Those don't prove anything. Karen suddenly snapped. There it was. Anger is often fear wearing a disguise. I have seen it countless times. When evidence appears, manipulative people frequently become aggressive. Not because they are strong, because they are cornered. I lean forward slightly. Then, perhaps the surveillance footage will help. The courtroom exploded with whispers. Karen's head snapped upward. The color vanished from her face. That reaction told me everything. You see, I hadn't yet revealed what was actually contained in the footage, but Karen already knew, because guilty people often recognize evidence before anyone describes it. At that moment, I became certain this case was much larger than a simple property dispute. Much larger. The prosecutor wasn't smiling. Emily wasn't smiling. Even I wasn't smiling, because I had just realized something disturbing. The damage to the bakery may not have been accidental at all. And if my suspicion was correct, Karen Whitmore wasn't simply hiding negligence, she was hiding intent. What appeared on that surveillance recording moments later would leave the entire courtroom staring at the screen in disbelief. And when the video started playing, even I struggled to understand what I was seeing. There are moments in a courtroom when everyone realizes they are witnessing something far more serious than they originally believed. This was one of those moments. I remember looking around the courtroom as the clerk prepared the evidence monitor. Nobody was speaking. Even the spectators sitting in the back rows had stopped moving. The tension was impossible to ignore. Karen Whitmore sat rigidly in her chair. Gone was the confident woman who had proudly announced she didn't follow rules. Gone was the smirk. Gone was the arrogance. Now she looked nervous, and that transformation interested me more than the evidence itself. Because people reveal their true character when control begins slipping away. Years on the bench taught me that confidence is easy when you think you're winning. Character is revealed when you're losing. The monitor flickered to life. The footage came from a security camera installed in the hallway of the commercial building. Nothing dramatic appeared at first, just a normal hallway, people entering, people leaving. Ordinary activity. Karen relaxed slightly. I noticed it immediately. She thought the footage was harmless. Then the timestamp advanced and everything changed. The video showed Karen standing near a maintenance access panel located directly above the bakery. She looked around repeatedly, left, right behind her. Then she removed something from her purse. The courtroom leaned forward almost simultaneously. I have rarely seen a room become so focused. Karen's eyes locked onto the screen. Emily covered her mouth. The jury stared without blinking, and I watched carefully. Not the footage, Karen. Because her reaction mattered just as much. The video showed her opening the maintenance panel. That alone violated building regulations, but it wasn't what shocked the courtroom. What happened next did. Karen reached inside and manipulated a valve connected to a water supply system. Then she closed the panel and walked away. The footage ended. Silence, domiciled silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I remember hearing only the faint hum of the courtroom air conditioning. Karen looked like she had stopped breathing. Emily looked like she had just seen a ghost. And I found myself asking a question I hadn't considered before. Why? Not whether she did it. The footage clearly showed she did something. The question was why. Human behavior fascinates me. Most wrongdoing has a motive: money, revenge, jealousy, control. The challenge is identifying which one. I turned toward Karen. Would you like to explain what you were doing in that footage? She immediately shook her head. I didn't touch anything. That answer surprised even me, because everyone in the courtroom had just watched her touch something. When evidence becomes undeniable, most people change strategies. Karen doubled down. That told me she was terrified. Psychologically, that's significant. People rarely cling to impossible lies unless the truth is far worse. I watched the jury exchange glances, not dramatic glances, concerned ones, the kind that say, why is she still lying? Then Emily Dawson requested permission to address the court. I granted it. What happened next transformed the emotional weight of the entire trial. Until that point, the case had focused on property damage numbers, invoices, repairs, financial loss. But Emily wasn't thinking about money. She stood slowly and walked toward the witness stand. Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear, from exhaustion. I spent 16 years working beside my father in that bakery. The courtroom remained silent. My dad built it from nothing. She paused. I noticed tears forming, not theatrical tears, real ones, the kind people fight desperately to hide. He passed away 8 months before the flood. Nobody interrupted, nobody dared. The bakery was the last thing I had left of him. I remember looking toward the spectators. Several people were visibly emotional. Even the bailiff stared downward. Emily continued. The water destroyed family photographs. She swallowed hard. My father's handwritten recipes. Another pause. The office where he worked every day. Karen refused to look at her. That bothered me. I've always believed eye contact reveals something important. People facing accusations often look directly at their accusers. Karen never did, not once. As Emily described walking into the flooded bakery that morning, I noticed something disturbing. Karen wasn't showing remorse. She wasn't showing sympathy. She wasn't showing regret. She looked angry that someone was exposing her. And that reaction changed my entire perception of the case, because remorse and guilt often coexist. But anger without remorse can indicate something darker. Then Emily revealed a detail that had never appeared in the initial filing, a detail that instantly explained why this conflict had started, a detail involving a confrontation that occurred 6 weeks before the flood, a confrontation involving a parking space. At first, the courtroom seemed confused. A parking space? What could that possibly have to do with $60,000 in damage? But when Emily described what Karen had allegedly said during that confrontation, I felt a chill run through the room, because if Emily was telling the truth, the flood was not an accident. It wasn't negligence, it wasn't carelessness, it was revenge. And there was someone waiting outside the courtroom who claimed they had heard every word, a witness who had never testified before, a witness whose testimony would either destroy Karen's defense completely or expose an entirely different truth hiding beneath the surface. And when the courtroom doors opened moments later, I realized this trial was about to become far more explosive than anyone expected. By the time the courtroom doors opened, the atmosphere had completely changed. When the hearing began that morning, most people expected a routine property damage dispute. Now, nobody believed that anymore. Not me, not the jury, not the spectators, and certainly not Karen Whitmore. I watched as the next witness entered the courtroom. His name was Daniel Foster, 58 years old, former building maintenance supervisor, a man who had worked in commercial property management for nearly 3 decades. The moment he walked in, Karen's reaction caught my attention. She didn't look surprised. She looked alarmed. There is a difference. Surprise lasts a second. Alarm changes your entire posture. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw tightened, and for the first time all day, she avoided looking toward the witness stand. That told me she knew exactly who he was, and perhaps more importantly, she knew what he might say. Daniel took the oath and settled into the witness chair. He appeared calm, measured, careful with his words. The kind of witness judges tend to trust because he wasn't trying to perform, he wasn't seeking attention, he simply looked like a man prepared to tell the truth. I asked him to explain his connection to the case. I managed maintenance operations for the building until last year. Simple, direct, no drama. Then came the question everyone was waiting for. Did you ever witness interactions between Ms. Dawson and Ms. Whitmore? Daniel nodded. Many times. The courtroom grew quiet. I noticed Karen staring at the table, still refusing eye contact, still refusing to acknowledge the people speaking about her. That behavior fascinated me. People often think confidence means speaking loudly. In reality, confidence often means being willing to face uncomfortable truths. Karen was doing everything possible to avoid them. Daniel continued. The problem started over parking. Exactly as Emily had described, months earlier, the bakery had been assigned a designated loading zone used for ingredient deliveries. According to building records, that space belonged to the bakery. Karen disagreed, not legally. Personally, she simply wanted it. And according to Daniel, she made that clear. Repeatedly, the more he spoke, the more the story began fitting together. Small complaints became larger confrontations. Arguments became threats. Warnings were ignored. Tensions escalated. I have seen similar patterns before. Many people imagine revenge begins with hatred. Often it begins with entitlement. Someone becomes convinced they deserve something. When reality disagrees, resentment grows. Eventually, resentment seeks punishment, and punishment seeks a target. Daniel then described the confrontation that changed everything, a confrontation he claimed to have witnessed personally. I heard Ms. Whitmore tell Ms. Dawson that she'd regret embarrassing her. The courtroom became still, very still. Threats carry weight in court, especially when bad things happen afterward. I asked him whether he remembered Karen's exact words. He hesitated, not because he was unsure, because he understood their significance. Then he answered. As best as I remember, he looked directly toward me. She said, people who get in my way usually lose everything. A murmur spread through the gallery. The bailiff immediately called for order. I remember studying Karen carefully. Most innocent people react strongly when false threats are attributed to them. Shock, disbelief. The outraged Karen displayed none of those reactions. Instead, she looked terrified, and that frightened me more than anger would have. Because fear often appears when a person knows a witness is telling the truth. Then something unexpected happened. Karen suddenly stood, without permission, without warning. He's lying. The outburst echoed across the courtroom. Spectators jumped. The jury looked startled. Daniel remained seated, calm, silent. Karen pointed toward him. He's always hated me. Years on the bench teach you to recognize desperation. This wasn't confidence. This wasn't righteous indignation. This was panic, rap panic. I instructed her to sit down. For several seconds, she remained standing. And in that moment, I saw something important. The mask was gone, completely gone. The polished image, the arrogance, the superiority, all of it had vanished. What remained was someone desperately trying to stop the truth from catching up to her. But the truth was moving faster than she expected. Because Daniel Foster wasn't the final witness, not even close. In fact, the most damaging testimony hadn't been heard yet. There was another individual waiting outside, someone Karen believed would never appear, someone connected to the surveillance footage, someone whose identity had been kept confidential until that very morning. And when I reviewed the sealed statement sitting inside my file, I remember feeling genuine shock, not because of what the witness saw, but because of who the witness was. I looked down at the name again, then back toward Karen. The moment she learned who was about to enter that courtroom, everything would unravel. The lies, the threats, the motive, all of it. And when the courtroom doors opened once again, Karen turned around, saw the person walking inside, and suddenly looked as though she had seen a ghost. I have witnessed countless dramatic moments in courtrooms throughout my career. People fainting, witnesses breaking down, families erupting into arguments, unexpected confessions. But there are only a handful of moments that genuinely shocked everyone in the room at the same time. What happened next was one of them. The courtroom doors opened slowly. Every head turned, every eye followed the person walking toward the witness stand. And the instant Karen Whitmore saw her, the color drained from her face, not gradually. Instantly, it was as though every ounce of confidence left her body in a single second. I remember narrowing my eyes because reactions like that matter. They often tell you more than testimony ever can. The woman entering the courtroom was Lauren Whitmore, Karen's younger sister. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Even the jury appeared surprised. Karen looked frozen, absolutely frozen. "Lauren," she whispered. The first time during the entire trial, genuine fear appeared on her face. Not anger, not frustration, fear, real fear. Lauren took the oath and sat down. Unlike Karen, she looked devastated. She wasn't angry. She wasn't seeking revenge. If anything, she looked heartbroken. I have learned over the years that some witnesses enter court wanting to win. Others enter because they can no longer live with a lie. Lauren belonged to the second category. I asked her to explain why she had come forward. The answer changed the entire case because I couldn't stay silent anymore. The courtroom became perfectly still. You could have heard a pin drop. Lauren swallowed hard before continuing. "My sister doesn't know this." She paused. Karen stared at her. The jury stared at her. I stared at her. Everyone waited. Then Lauren delivered the sentence that shattered Karen's defense. "I was with her the night before the flood." The room exploded with whispers. The bailiff immediately restored order. But the damage had already been done. Karen lowered her head, and I knew whatever came next would be devastating. Lauren described meeting Karen for dinner the evening before the bakery was damaged. According to her testimony, Karen spent nearly the entire evening talking about Emily Dawson, not the lawsuit, not the building. Emily, that detail caught my attention immediately. Obsession often precedes retaliation. The people who seek revenge frequently stop focusing on the problem and start focusing on the person. Lauren described Karen's growing resentment, the parking dispute, the complaints, the warnings, the embarrassment of being repeatedly told she was wrong. And then Lauren revealed something that made the entire courtroom fall silent again. Karen had allegedly confessed her plan. Not directly, not in legal terms, but clearly enough. Lauren looked down briefly before speaking. I remember asking her why she seemed so happy. The witness paused. Tears formed in her eyes. Then she continued. She told me that by tomorrow morning, Emily would finally learn her place. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Karen remained silent. I watched the jury carefully. Several members were writing notes rapidly. Others simply stared, trying to process what they were hearing. Lauren then revealed the detail that turned the case from shocking to unbelievable. Karen had taken a photograph that night. A photograph she proudly showed her sister, a photograph of the maintenance panel, the same maintenance panel shown in the surveillance footage. And unlike Karen, Lauren had saved the image. The courtroom gasped. I will never forget that moment, because Karen's expression told me she had completely forgotten the photograph existed. Her eyes widened, her mouth opened slightly, and for several seconds she looked incapable of speaking. The prosecutor introduced the photograph into evidence. The image appeared on the courtroom monitor, top-mented, verified, authentic. The maintenance panel was open, the valve was visible, and reflected faintly in the metal surface was Karen herself. The courtroom erupted. People were literally turning toward each other in disbelief. The bailiff struggled to restore order. Emily Dawson covered her face and began crying, not dramatic crying, relief, months of stress, months of frustration, months of wondering whether anyone would ever believe her. And now the truth was unfolding in front of everyone. But what happened next became the viral moment people would talk about for years, because Karen suddenly stood up again. This time, nobody stopped her. Nobody expected what came next. She turned toward her sister and completely lost control. The calm, confident woman who entered court that morning vanished. She screamed, accused, threatened, blamed everyone except herself. The jury watched in disbelief. The spectators watched in disbelief. Even I found myself stunned by the outburst. And then, in the middle of her rant, Karen said something she immediately wished she could take back, something that transformed suspicion into near certain proof, a single sentence. 7 words that accidentally revealed exactly what she had done. The moment those words left her mouth, the entire courtroom went silent, and Karen realized she had just destroyed herself. I have often said that the most damaging testimonies in a courtroom doesn't always come from witnesses. Sometimes it comes from the defendant. One careless sentence, one emotional outburst, one moment when anger overpowers caution. That is all it takes. Karen Whitmore learned that lesson in front of an entire courtroom. The room was already tense when she exploded at her sister. Spectators were leaning forward. The jury was watching every movement. Emily Dawson sat quietly at her table, tears still visible in her eyes. And Karen was unraveling. She pointed at Lauren with trembling hands. Years of resentment seemed to pour out all at once. "You had no right to betray me." Nobody interrupted. Not yet, because everyone sensed something important was happening. Then came the sentence that changed everything. Karen shouted, "I only opened the valve for a few minutes." Silence, docile silence, the kind of silence that seems to suck the air from a room. The moment those words left her mouth, Karen froze. She realized it instantly. So did everyone else. I remember watching her face, the panic, the regret, the desperate attempt to mentally pull the words back. But words don't work that way. Once spoken, they belong to the record. And Karen had just admitted knowledge that an innocent person shouldn't possess. Nobody had testified about how long the valve had been open. Nobody had introduced that detail. Nobody had even mentioned timing, yet Karen volunteered it herself. That wasn't proof by itself. But psychologically, it was devastating, because guilty knowledge often reveals itself unexpectedly. People tell on themselves when emotions overwhelm discipline. The jury understood that. I understood that. And judging by Karen's expression, she understood it too. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Karen did something I had not anticipated. She sat down slowly. The anger vanished. The shouting vanished. The arrogance vanished. Everything vanished. In its place sat a woman who finally understood that the walls had closed around her. I've watched that transformation many times throughout my career. The moment resistance dies, the moment reality arrives, the moment someone realizes they are no longer controlling the story, Karen lowered her head, and for the first time all day, she cried, not loudly, not dramatically. Quietly, the courtroom remained still, no celebration, no cheering, no triumph. Because despite everything, there was something deeply sad about what we were witnessing. A woman had allowed pride to become obsession. Obsession had become resentment, and resentment had become destruction. The prosecutor then delivered the final blow. A forensic plumbing expert testified that the valve shown in the surveillance footage directly controlled the water line that ultimately flooded the bakery, not a similar valve, not a nearby valve, the exact valve. The expert further explained that the resulting damage matched the timeline established by surveillance records. Every piece fit together: the warnings, the threats, the footage, the photograph, the witness testimony, the accidental admission. Separately, each piece was significant. Together, they were overwhelming. I remember looking toward Karen. She no longer appeared angry. She no longer appeared defiant. She looked exhausted, broken, defeated, and then something happened that I will never forget. Karen stood one final time, but this time her voice was completely different. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the superiority. Gone was the woman who proudly announced she didn't follow rules. She looked directly at me and said, "Please, just one word, please." The courtroom listened. She swallowed hard, tears running down her face. I made a mistake. Another pause. I didn't think it would go that far. More tears. I never wanted to destroy everything. And then she said the words nobody expected. The words that completed the truth. I just wanted to hurt her. The courtroom remained silent because at last there it was, the motive, not money, not necessity, not confusion, not accident, revenge, pure revenge. Against a woman whose only crime had been refusing to surrender a parking space she legally owned. I looked toward Emily Dawson. The bakery owner wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She simply looked relieved, as though she could finally breathe again. The truth had finally been spoken out loud, under oath, in front of everyone, and now only one thing remained: my judgment, the decision that would determine Karen Whitmore's future. I had already reached my conclusion, but before I announced it, I wanted the courtroom to understand something important, something far bigger than damaged property, something about entitlement, accountability, and the dangerous consequences of believing rules exist for everyone except yourself. When I finally began speaking, the entire courtroom listened, and Karen started crying even harder before I had finished my first sentence. I have spent much of my life sitting behind a bench, listening to people explain their decisions. Some decisions are made in fear, some are made in desperation. Some are made out of love, and some are made because a person becomes convinced they are entitled to act without consequences. Karen Whitmore's case belonged to that last category. As I prepared to deliver my ruling, the courtroom was completely silent. No whispers, no movement, no distractions. Everyone understood that the story had reached its conclusion. Karen sat with her head lowered. The confident woman who had walked into court that morning no longer existed. In her place sat someone forced to confront the reality of her own choices. Emily Dawson sat across the room. She looked exhausted. But there was something else in her expression. Relief, not happiness, relief. There is an important difference. People who genuinely suffer loss are rarely interested in revenge, most simply want acknowledgement, vilification, the truth, and Emily had finally received all three. I folded my hands and looked directly at Karen. Over the years, I have learned that judgment is not simply about punishment. Punishment alone teaches very little. A proper judgment explains why accountability matters. And this case offered a lesson that everyone in that courtroom needed to hear, including Karen. "Ms. Whitmore," I began. My voice echoed softly through the room. "You repeatedly ignored written warnings." She stared at the table. "You violated building regulations." No response. "You interfered with property that did not belong to you." Still nothing. "You attempted to deny documented evidence." Tears rolled down her face. "And ultimately, you admitted your actions were motivated by the desire to hurt another person." The silence felt heavy. I continued. "Throughout this trial, I have heard discussions about parking spaces, maintenance panels, property damage, and repair costs." I paused. But this case was never really about any of those things. Several jurors looked up. Karen slowly raised her eyes. "This case is about entitlement." The courtroom remained completely still. I will never forget the look on Karen's face when she heard that word, because she knew it was true. Entitlement, the belief that your feelings matter more than rules, the belief that your frustration justifies your behavior, the belief that consequences apply to everyone else. In my experience, that mindset destroys relationships, businesses, families, and sometimes lives. I looked toward the evidence monitor, then back toward Karen. "You told this court that you do not follow rules." The words hung in the air, the exact sentence that had started everything, the sentence she probably wished she could erase forever. I continued. "Rules exist because society depends on them." Another pause. "When people decide they are above those rules, innocent people suffer." Emily lowered her eyes. The bakery photographs remained visible on the evidence screen. Guided equipment, flooded floors, ruined family property, damage that never needed to happen. I announced the financial judgment. Full compensation for repair costs, lost business income, additional damages permitted under the evidence presented. The total amount was substantial. Karen closed her eyes. More tears followed, but I wasn't finished. There was one final observation I wanted to leave with everyone present, including the audience watching this story now. I leaned slightly forward, and I spoke from experience. During my years as a judge, I have seen intelligent people ruin their lives because they confused being powerful with being right. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. They believed winning an argument mattered more than doing the right thing. I looked directly at Karen, and by the time they realized the difference, it was too late. The courtroom remained silent. Karen whispered something so quietly that only those closest could hear. "I'm sorry." I believe she meant it, not because she had been caught, because reality had finally reached her. The trial concluded shortly afterward. People slowly left the courtroom, spectators discussing what they had witnessed, jurors reflecting on the evidence, attorneys gathering their files. Emily Dawson paused before leaving. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply thanked the court and walked away. That moment stayed with me because dignity often speaks louder than victory. As for Karen Whitmore, I never forgot the image of her standing confidently in court, proudly declaring that she didn't follow rules, and I never forgot what happened afterward. 30 seconds later, the same woman was desperately asking for mercy, not because the court was cruel, not because anyone targeted her unfairly, but because actions have consequences. Eventually, they always do. If there is one lesson I carried away from that case, it is this: character is not revealed when life is easy. Character is revealed when we are told no. Some people accept it, some people learn from it, and some people allow their pride to destroy everything they work to build. Karen Whitmore made her choice. The courtroom simply delivered the bill. And believe me, that is a lesson I have never forgotten.